Well, thank you, Paige, for having me here and introducing me. And it's an honor to be here. I'm all the way from Amsterdam, visiting Boston. That is quite a treat, I can say. And I just saw the exhibition as well, which I really love to see. So today I will talk about Van Gogh and the mad genius debate. I just have the handout myself as well. I'll just have it here just in case there are questions about that. But is there such a thing as a mad genius? Well, at least we can say there is an image of it, a persistent one, you could say, based on the age-old idea that genius and madness often coincide, known today as the relationship between creativity and mental illness. And Vincent van Gogh is often named as the most famous example. It is debated for centuries if there actually exists such a relationship. And to this day, there is no consensus. There is no convincing evidence, only indications which are largely based on ancient ideas and assumptions. In my PhD research, I have studied this relationship. You see here the cover. It's written in Dutch. I do hope to have an English translation one day as well, but maybe a little bit thinner because it's quite a big study, you can see. Needed as well. And in my research, I had no intention whatsoever to solve the question if there is such a connection. I was interested in the history of it. Why did medical doctors and psychologists study genius in the past and creativity more recently, and how did they study this relationship? What are the origins of this idea, and how did artists perceive the idea themselves? I'll come back shortly to this later, because we have today, of course, Van Gogh being central, often referred to as the mad genius. And I'm sure that as followers of this course and visitors of the exhibition, you probably already learned that this idea of Van Gogh as a lonely, suffering, insane artist just messing about is a false narrative. And I really like the first sentence in the text of the exhibition. Van Gogh yearned for meaningful connection, because that is quite true. Yes, he was lonely, but he was constantly on the lookout for people who could provide companionship and inspiration, such as the Rollin family. His career may not have gone smoothly, but he always worked hard. And as an artist, he had the aim to exhibit and sell his paintings. He hoped to work with other artists, and he even sought to establish an artist association. So Vincent van Gogh was a man full of vision and impetuous dynamism, and yes, he struggled, like many of us do, and some more than others, of course. So today, I'd like to address two questions. How did Van Gogh perceive the relationship between his work and mental health? And what did he know about the age-old idea of genius and madness? And in order to answer this question, I also have to give a bit of the context on that idea of genius and madness. I'll keep it short. And in his lecture, I will make a clear distinction between Van Gogh's life and work before he became seriously ill and after he became ill. So I will highlight especially the summer of 1888, when he made this self-portrait, for instance. I will talk about that one. And also the autumn of 1889, when he was in the asylum, and I will discuss these two self-portraits you see here. And I will also address the illness itself. What do we know about it? Was there a diagnosis? And how did he cope with it? And just a disclaimer, maybe sometimes the words can be quite sensitive. I can use the word madness, insane. Please know that it's just a bit of the historical context when they were used often. So I don't mean anything about that, so please know that it's just a bit of history. Well, I had the quote in my title a little bit shortened. The quote is exactly, "Let me quietly continue my work. If it's that of a madman, well, too bad. Tant pis in French." And Van Gogh wrote this at the end of January 1889 in Arles, a month after he cut off his ear, and was already able to paint for 2 weeks with undiminished ambition. He started with a portrait of his doctor and 2 self-portraits, one you see here. And the painting he was referring to in this quote was a portrait of Madame Roulin. There are two in the exhibition, which are quite nice to see. This one, the Kröller-Müller version, is the first one he made, which he started in December and finished after he came back from when he left the hospital in January 1889. And the second version he was also ready at the 28th of January when he wrote the sentence. The Boston version is the last one, I believe, which is now sort of the idea. So let me quietly continue my work. If it's that of a madman, well, too bad. Van Gogh is saying a lot with this one sentence. It is about him choosing the path of becoming an artist at a later age, 27 to be precise, and he was 35 when he wrote this letter. So let me quietly continue my work. And not just an artist, but a very ambitious one, who wanted to change the course of modern art, maybe not yet understood. So if it's that of a madman, well, too bad. But Van Gogh was also modest about his work, as a typical Dutch Protestant. He was still learning and developing himself artistically. He realized the painting of Madame Roulin could come across as a cheap reproductive print because of the bright colors and the flat planes, and therefore maybe the work of a madman. But for him it was serious. It was the image of Madame Roulin, his beloved friend who was rocking her newborn baby in the cradle. And moreover, she represented comfort in general. He was thinking of a conversation he had with Paul Gauguin about the hard life of Icelandic fishermen and their homesickness, and the way they pinned up an image of a saint in the boat. Van Gogh believed the waves of the sea must have reminded these fishermen of lying in the cradle and being lullabied by their mothers. And the arrangement of colors and the dynamic wall print were well thought out. And I saw that especially in the Boston version, which is very much, you see, control how he made that painting. And he believed that if this painting would hang in a fisher boat, like the images of a saint, the lullabies would be felt. And just to give an impression, if you are a bit sensitive to migraine, maybe close your eyes for a moment, but we will rock the painting for a moment, just to get the impression that sort of, this is the idea of comfort. Comforting into sleep once done by your mother. But maybe this was the work of a madman. I believe in the same way the face of Madame Roulin was comforting to Van Gogh. Just as a comparison, also the painting which is in the exhibition, the dance hall in Arles, which he made during his time with Gauguin, Van Gogh depicted an overcrowded place. It was probably loud and disturbing, and we know that Van Gogh was extremely tired and agitated in this period. And there's only one person looking at him, of all the anonymous faces you see here, Madame Roulin. She is the friendly face in the crowd. She is his comfort, I believe. And of course, Van Gogh realized he may well become a madman. He could not ignore his own health and his mad behavior of cutting off his ear, the hallucinations and the confused state he was in at Christmas and the days after. That must have been frightening. So there's a lot in this one sentence, I feel. But in the same letter of the 28th of January, he was rather hopeful, as the same letter starts with the sentences, you'll see on the slide, just a few words to tell you that I'm getting along so-so, comme ci, comme ça, in original French, as regards my health and work, which I already find astonishing when I compare my state today with that of a month ago. I well knew that one could break one's arms and legs before, and that then afterwards that could get better. But I didn't know that one could break one's brain, and that afterwards that got better too. And then he continues to inform his brother about the progress of his work, including the Madame Roulin portrait. So when you dive into Van Gogh's work, you cannot escape his biography, for his life and work are often intertwined. And Van Gogh himself realized that his work as an artist was risky. This he based on the age-old commonplace, the idea that genius and madness often coincided, as I mentioned in the beginning. And it had become a caricature in the early 19th century as well, such as here in the satire of Romantic Suicide by Elensa Igneto. You see here the poor poet sort of threatened to fall from this not that high of a rock into his knife, and he left his work here on the rock with a laurel on the cross, as in a way to show that once I'm dead, I will be famous, I will be known for my work. I need to sacrifice myself. And it's a bit pathetic in a way, it is a caricature. And 2 men already went before him, so it's not always successful to do this if you want to have a long-lasting reputation. And it was also ridiculed in many 19th century novels, such as by Balzac and by Émile Zola, The Masterpiece. And this is actually the first edition of the English translation in the 1880s. And in these novels, the main character is a painter who is unstable, irrational, over-emotional, misunderstood, and who sacrificed everything for his work, literally his life in the end. A fervent reader of these writers, Van Gogh was not too impressed by the way they depicted the painter. Already in 1882, he wrote to Theo, "It appears that writers are always unfortunate with painter characters, Balzac among them. His paintings are fairly uninteresting." Not that Van Gogh denied that these fictional painters existed in real life, but he felt it was only a one-sided image that writers were repeating again and again. And it's clearly a strong image that artists are unstable, irrational, and suffering creatures. Artists themselves confirmed it as well. For instance, Eugène Delacroix, the great painter in the first half of the 19th century, he wrote in his unpublished autobiographical manuscripts in 1853, so it was later in his life, "The history of our time presents sad examples of the unhappy lives of artists." And one of these sad examples Delacroix mentioned was the painter Gros, who was a famous contemporary of Delacroix, whose body was found in the river in 1835. It was said he drowned himself after his success had died out. And here we see the moment Gros walks into the river. And this image of the suffering artist, we still see it in movies and series. It's hard to get rid of, I think. And it seems to confirm that there is such a thing as a relationship between creativity and mental illness. But where does that idea come from? Well, this is a complicated and quite ambiguous story, one that I try to unravel in my PhD research. Spans over centuries and takes up hundreds of pages, and I won't bother you with the many details and nuances, but a few main points I would like to make, just to give you a bit of the context of that idea. First of all, we have to go back more than 2,000 years ago for the famous statement by Plato. Probably you know this one, "The greatest of good things come to us through madness." And this quote has been repeated in these 2,000 years over and over and over again. And medical doctors, thinkers, artists of all sorts have pondered and commented on this assumption. But there are, of course, a few questions. What does madness mean here with Plato and later on? And what is a genius exactly? Well, since the 18th century, madness is interpreted as mental illness, and therefore the medical doctors who were interested in the mind, later to be called psychiatrists, dived into the mysteries of genius. It's not accidental that when they started to look into genius and the mental illness, it was also the beginning of psychiatry. And these psychiatrists, avant la lettre, they sought to determine what makes someone a genius. If it was defined by the body or the mind, if it was comparable to mental illness, even if there is a direct relationship between creative brilliance and mental health. How genius was perceived followed from the state of medicine at that time. Well, around 1800, mental illness was usually defined as a false perception, caused by uncontrolled emotions and an overactive imagination. And you had also the newly adopted medical term, the hallucination. And there was a bit of the question, where does the imagination end and the hallucination starts? It was in this context in which Dr. Lelu studied Socrates, the thinker, and his demon. And Socrates spoke about this inner voice who advised him especially what not to do. And Lelu thought, well, this voice was only heard by Socrates. So there must have been hallucinations. And hallucinations was a symptom of mental illness. But because of his healthy constitution, Socrates was able to maintain his obsessive intellectual faculties. He didn't become completely mad, insane, or mentally ill, or well, whatever you want to call that. And that's quite an important thing to realize as well, that somewhere around 1800, psychiatrists realized that you can be mentally ill and still function properly. You can have hallucinations, but just function in a society. So there were many different degrees in illness. And during the 19th century, it became more common to perceive mental illness as a physical condition caused by a sensitive nervous system related to heredity, degeneration, and partly lifestyle. The prospects were now less optimistic. And for example, Dr. Moreau de Tour, he presented the hereditary nervous system as a tree whose branches could lead to all kinds of illnesses. You see that here also on the slide. You have anesthesia, neurosis, hysteria, tics, and all kinds of horrible brain diseases at the time. But it could also lead to exceptional intelligence of the arts, sciences, the music, etc. So in one family, you could have someone suffering from idiocy and also having an exceptional mind. And Lombroso, you probably know him, he took over Moreau's theory even further in his famous Genius and Madness, or The Man of Genius, also translated, which knew many editions and translations. And to be sure, which I really like to emphasize, these theories were often dismissed as scientific gossip, already at the time, also by medical doctors, but they were repeated nonetheless. And therefore still, we know still Lombroso, whereas contemporaries who were critical about him, we probably don't know. And despite the lack of medical consensus, the commonplace itself was rarely denied, and these ideas of an overactive imagination, obsessive and eccentric character, and sensitive nerves remained attached to genius, and especially the creative ones. And I'm sure many examples of famous geniuses over the centuries pop up with you now, which only seem to confirm the presumed connection. But what is often overlooked in this narrative by psychiatrists is that Plato was not talking about mental illness. Because if the statement continues, I'll repeat first, the greatest of good things come to us through madness, the sort, mind you, which is given as a divine gift. So he talks about inspiration coming from above. It does mean that Plato describes the poet as this passive creator, something comes from above to him, something external to him. And this idea of inspiration and greatness coming from outside is repeated over the centuries by thinkers and artists. And here you see a painting by Delacroix, where he depicted Socrates with his demon in the form of an angel whispering him in the ear. This is inspiration, which Delacroix depicts here. It has nothing to do with hallucinations, as Dr. Lelou was trying to say. And also to give a bit of the context, when you talk about creativity in the 18th and 19th century, it's often still considered to be that only God can create. As an artist, you could imitate God, you could imitate nature, but only God could create. And somewhere after around 1800s, the idea existed that artists themselves were creators. And then divine inspiration was replaced by creative imagination. So then the artist himself had control over it. That was inside the body. However, not so much in the 19th century novels revolving around these dramatic and irrational painters, so again here, because the painters are depicted passively as if they are taken over by something else when they create. So I explain all this of the context because this image of the fragile, irrational artist being taken over by something is still very much present, I believe. And also with Van Gogh, if you see how he's depicted in movies, series, novels, or in some lectures, he's often presented as this is just messing about. So, Van Gogh, let's go there. We save all the questions for the end, so please, if you have a question, write it down so you can remember it for later on, because I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts about this. But what was Van Gogh's view on the relationship between his health and work before he became ill? Let's start with that. We know that he was interested in health issues and liked to consult medical manuals and doctors. However, there is no sign that he read about the specific medical theories on genius and madness. He did refer to medical commonplaces I just mentioned quite frequently. Especially in Arles, he discussed with his brother and colleague painters the artistic lifestyle and his belief that artists were prone to illness. And he referred to his mind and recurring feelings of malaise after a long day of work as a névrose, which you also saw with Dr. Moreau in the tree. And névrose, translated as neurosis, to be sure, that's before Freud. It means a bit nervousness here, which is caused by the sensitive nervous system, degeneration, and their lifestyle. And as Van Gogh explained himself in a letter to his brother, "My poor friend, our neurosis, etc., surely also comes from a rather too artistic way of life, but it's also a fatal inheritance, since in civilization we go on becoming weaker from generation to generation." So this is sort of the perfect definition, I think, of degeneration given by Van Gogh. And there was nothing one could do. You just had to deal with it. And the body was a burden in this belief. Van Gogh did see a relationship between his art and health, however, in several ways, both positively and negatively, and often with cause and effect intertwined. This also came up a lot during the summer of 1888, when his ambitions were at the very height. Because he hoped to create an artist association in Arles, which is why he rented the Yellow House, which had the goal to serve as a shelter and refuge for his pals when they were struggling. So this part he rented. Also an exhibition, to sort of a sense of how small that was. And he hoped that Gauguin and Émile Bernard would come as well. And you see here Van Gogh on his back, sitting with the young Bernard in Paris. And it was also a place where they would determine the course of modern art. So quite ambitious what he wanted to do there. And when Gauguin promised to come, Van Gogh had his work cut out for him. He needed to have the Yellow House ready. For weeks he made many paintings during long days in the sun and in the fields to decorate the house and to show Gauguin his process. But the hard work took its toll on Van Gogh. He wrote to his brother, "Painting only cost me my broken down carcass, my mind pretty well cracked as far as living as I could and should goes. It's only cost you, let's say, around 15,000 francs that you've advanced me." So he's referring here to the allowance he received from Theo since 1882, which made his brother co-owner of the painting. So it was not simple charity what Theo was doing for Van Gogh. And Van Gogh is expressing here the hope that Theo would join him in the south of France and lead this artist colony as an art dealer. And that gave pressure, of course. Van Gogh felt his dependence on Theo as a burden and wanted to be independent as soon as possible. His paintings had to provide him a living. If there only was a patron who loved his work. So in that same letter he writes, "If only I could find that art lover and not be such a burden on you. After the crisis I went through when I came here, I can no longer make plans or anything else. I'm definitely better now, but hope, the desire to achieve, is broken, and I work from necessity, so as not to suffer so much mentally to distract myself." So note, the crisis Van Gogh is referring to here was in the spring, in the beginning of Arles, when he had worked very hard in the orchards to capture the blossoming trees. An example you see here. And he believed that these joyful paintings would easily find an audience. And after a few weeks, he was exhausted and could not paint for a while. And he was, in the summer, working in the fields, he was almost at that breaking point as well. So all before Gauguin came. So we see Van Gogh saying his work is a necessity. He did not know what else to do. And also as a distraction. So maybe even sort of a medicine for his suffering. And at the same time, Van Gogh believed that the suffering made a better artist of him. The more I become dissipated, ill, a broken picture, the more I too become a creative artist in that great revival of art of which we're speaking. And because of the sacrifice you had to make as an artist, he believed that artists were forced to adopt an unconventional lifestyle, which led society to look down on them. And then in the same letter he writes this, considering, if you will, the times in which we live as a true and great revival of art, the moth-eaten and official tradition which is still on its feet, but which is at bottom powerless and bone-idle, the new painters alone, poor, treated like madmen, and as a result of this treatment, becoming so in fact, at least as far as their social life is concerned. So it was still this idea of the more traditional art. Van Gogh wanted to make new art, and it was avant-garde art, and it was not just understood. So society was looking down on him and the other artists. So society was just as guilty for the artists being treated as madmen as the artist's own pursuit of making the greatest art possible. So we see these different views on the relationship between Van Gogh's health and his work. But there's one thing that was consistent, and that is that Van Gogh saw various risks in the artist's life. And there was little he could do about his nervous temperament and rejection by society, but there were ways to deal with these issues. So for one, Van Gogh drew much comfort and inspiration from the lives of artists he admired and who had experienced similar struggles. So again, one of these examples was Delacroix, who also suffered from the pressure of creating art. So Van Gogh loved to read about his and ideas of Delacroix, how he dealt with that suffering, and also how he was written about by others. And there was a sort of a few sentences that Van Gogh repeated 3 times in a letter, which he found was a beautiful description of Delacroix, his work, after Delacroix had died. And the sentence goes as follows. Thus died, almost smiling, Eugène Delacroix, a painter of high breeding, who had the sun in his head and a thunderstorm in his heart, who went from warriors to saints, from saints to lovers, from lovers to tigers, and from tigers to flowers. So Delacroix is portrayed here as an artist with an eye for both the misery and the grandeur of life, someone who had experienced all human passions himself, and was therefore able to evoke them in his work, but who, despite the troubled existence, was able to die almost smiling, knowing that he left behind a rich and meaningful oeuvre. And in the summer of 1888, when Van Gogh was working really hard, when he repeatedly made his statements about the relationship between his painting and his health, he often referred to other artists with even greater thunderstorms in their hearts. When he became exhausted after weeks of painting in the wheat fields, he wrote to Theo, and I think very, very often, of that excellent painter Monticelli, who people said was such a drinker and insane. An example of the work of Monticelli you see here, a still life of flowers, and he was known for his very colorful work and very thickly applied paint to the canvas, but unfortunately most of his paintings have discolored over time, it's darkened, so it's really hard to see what Van Gogh really liked in him, though this is still sort of a nice impression of the colorful work he could make. And yes, Monticelli was quite a drinker, and Van Gogh knew that drinking was bad for you, but it was for him, he said, sort of a relaxation. Afterwards, after working hard, the only thing that comforts and distracts is to stun oneself by taking a stiff drink or smoke very heavily. No, it's bad for you, but you had to relax in one way or the other. And he again expressed Delacroix, who also had overtaxed his brain, as he called it, but because of his more privileged position, Delacroix was better able to take care of himself than Van Gogh. And to Bernard, the young artist, Van Gogh confessed, our bodies are despicable and sometimes a heavy burden, but since Giotto, a sickly character, that's the way things are. And Giotto, the well-known painter in the early Renaissance, you see here the example of his frescoes he made in Italy. Apparently he was known as a sickly character, not sure what was meant by it, but for Van Gogh, it reassured him that artists had been struggling with their bodies since the time of Giotto. Here you see Mérion, another artist with a heavy burden to bear. And Van Gogh had read about this, the life of this artist, an etcher, who had psychosis and was admitted in a psychiatric institution. And there he refused to eat and died of starvation in 1868. And Van Gogh often referred to the suffering of this etcher, also when discussing the sorrows of his friends with his brother. So, for example, he was afraid that if Gauguin did not get recognition for his work soon, he could pack out like Miriam, discouraged. And when financial worries threatened Van Gogh to overwhelm him in early October, so just before Gauguin came, Vincent wrote to his brother, "But I have a horror 1,000 times of these melancholies à la Miriam." So gloominess was always part of Van Gogh's state of mind, and it was especially during this summer that he increasingly referred to the age-old image of the suffering artist to express concerns about the future to Theo. For example, by mentioning this painter, painting and painter. You see here Hugo van der Goes, a 15th century painter in Belgium, known as the Flemish Primitives, and he was also got ill later in his life and was taken care of by monks in the cloister. And it's quite telling what Van Gogh say here about it, because you see here Van der Goes with his sort of tense hands, the eyes wide open, the mouth slightly open, everything is in tension, and even the carpet is sort of wrinkled underneath him. And Van Gogh is saying, and this is maybe a week before Gauguin came, "I am not ill, but I become so without any doubt if I didn't take hearty food and if I didn't stop painting for a few days. In fact, I'm once again nearly reduced to the state of madness of Hugo van der Goes in Emile Wouter's painting." Van Gogh had seen this painting, and he also had a reproduction of it. And here in the detail you see it even better, but you see also here the monk behind him, more of the sort of the calm one, looking everything, looking over everything. And that's important with Van Gogh, because you always have to read his quotes in the whole context, because he continues, "And if it wasn't for the fact that I had something of a dual nature, something of both the monk and the painter, I should be, and that long since, utterly and entirely reduced to the above-mentioned state." So he had still balance. He was able to find the balance, and he sort of needed antidotes for getting that balance. Well, antidotes. What did he mean by that? He found antidotes, for instance, in the paintings by artists he admired. He had the example of Delacroix already and Monticelli, but also here Hope of Buffy de Chavannes. And he found antidote in the medical advices he had sought during his lifetime, such as from Dr. Gruby, the doctor in Paris who also took care of Theo. And he advised, "Eat well, live well, see few women." Well, the first two were quite challenging for Van Gogh, because he didn't eat well. And he drank a lot, we can say. He admitted it himself. The self-portrait he made at the end of his stay in Paris. And he wrote later on, when he was in Arles already, to his sister, "I was certainly well on the way to catching a paralysis because of the alcohol. It caught up with me afterwards right enough," he said to her. So he had to deal with this alcohol abuses in Paris, and he was still drinking quite a lot in Arles as well. But Van Gogh also found the antidote in his own work. He had high expectations of the Yellow House as an artist association, and he believed it could serve as a brotherhood of geniuses, where artists would constantly exchange works and ideas. And before the arrival of Paul Gauguin, Van Gogh already tried to put this brotherhood into practice. Because one of the highest goals of modern art, Van Gogh believed, was the modern portrait, which is the Roulin exhibition is about. Because it was for him the true modern man he wanted to depict. You see here an example of a portrait made by Van Gogh. And he also asked Gauguin and Bernard to also make portraits of each other. They were together in Pont-Aven at the time, in an artist colony in the north of France. And Gauguin and Bernard took their time to do it, and in the end they didn't make portraits of each other as much as they made a self-portrait. So you see Gauguin here, but he did add this sort of sketch portrait of Bernard, and Bernard did the same thing. And Gauguin described the painting to Van Gogh in a letter, saying that he feels as this rejected artist by society, like the novel Victor Hugo, Les Misérables, which is mentioned here, Les Misérables, with the character Jean Valjean, him being rejected by society. The same Van Gogh felt, the same Gauguin felt. And Van Gogh loved the description in the letter, but when he saw the painting in real life, he was not so impressed. He felt it was way too depressing, way too melancholic. He liked to have his art more joyful, which he was trying to do himself with, for instance, the poet here. And this was the idea that this portrait was an artist's friend of Van Gogh. He probably meant Gauguin, but because Gauguin wasn't there in Arles yet, he depicted another artist instead. He liked to work from nature. And it's Eugène Boch, a Belgian artist, with a Dantesque hat, as Van Gogh called it. And it's sort of the enlightened hat, sort of this genius painter against this dark, starry sky representing infinity. So it's sort of the artist, the genius artist as a dreamer, working for infinity, for recognition. And as a counterpart, Van Gogh made this self-portrait himself, of course, one of the shining examples in the exhibition. And this was the idea of a balance again. So this is the dreamer, and he himself depicted himself more as down to earth. He was more the joyful artist, more sort of in a sober coloring, a very bright background. And he saw also the balance between the self-portrait by Gauguin and his own self-portrait. So this one was Gauguin was the melancholic artist, whereas Van Gogh was the more joyful artist. Maybe not sometimes hard to imagine, because we often see Van Gogh as this sort of sober, serious man. We had quite humor, so and could be quite joyful, I think. And also sort of the idea of the sick artist and the healthy artist. Not that Van Gogh was specifically healthy, but it was finding the balance again. It's always about finding the balance. And he hoped to achieve that balance with the Yellow House, which turned out to be in vain, as we all know. Clearly, Van Gogh was already exhausted before Gauguin came, and it turned out Gauguin was not in much better shape himself when he arrived in Arles. They seemed to work in harmony for some weeks, but winter was coming, the days grew shorter, alcohol was flowing, and the Yellow House was way too small for these two big personalities. And as it turned out, they did not agree on the course of modern art. They had endless discussions, electrifying as Van Gogh called them. The situation had become unbearable, and after Van Gogh cut off his ear in a drunken and desperate state, Gauguin left for good. Van Gogh was admitted to the hospital, and the dream of the Yellow House had burst. So before I return to Van Gogh's attitude towards the relationship between his work and health, let's consider the nature of his illness for a moment. And sort of one short trip down memory lane, at least for me. In 2016, we had the exhibition at the Van Gogh Museum, Van Gogh and His Illness, and with an expert meeting of doctors and Van Gogh experts, trying to find out what was wrong with Van Gogh. Well, it was not a big success with the conclusions. Maybe I can say a bit about it later on. But for now, I just want to stress that there are many diagnoses suggested for Van Gogh after his death, but we have to make a clear distinction between the contemporary illness, which was the diagnosis which was given in his lifetime, and of course the many which followed afterwards. And I think his own doctor, Rey, the first doctor he saw when he cut off his ear in the hospital, he probably identified the illness in the best way. He said that the chief cause lay in the painter's consumption of alcohol and coffee and too little food, as well as the extreme excitability that must form the essence of his character, the sensitive idea, which also Van Gogh stressed, that he had just an artistic temperament. He was sensitive. The first official diagnosis that was recorded by the senior physician, Jules Urpart. And he said in the register that Van Gogh had an attack of acute mania with generalized delirium, Well, to be sure, these are very broad terms in the 19th century. It doesn't mean that much, mania and delirium. And things went badly for Van Gogh during the first few days in the hospital when he was very confused. But he gradually improved and was allowed to leave the hospital as early as 7 January. And Van Gogh himself was quite optimistic. I hope that I've just had a simple artist bout of craziness. That's one of the hazards of the job. And I had to deal with that as an artist. But 2 more episodes followed in which he was confused, had a reduced consciousness, and could not work for a few days. In the meantime, he discussed his illnesses at length with his doctor Rij, who he considered a confidant. Rij must have suspected during this period, when the illness became more and more severe, that Van Gogh's illness was a form of epilepsy. He never put it down in black and white, but this can be inferred from Van Gogh's letters. For example, he writes to Theo, "I'm a madman or an epileptic, probably for good, although from what I've heard tell, there are 50,000 epileptics in France, of whom only 4,000 are confined, and that is just not so extraordinary." So it was sort of a peaceful idea. He was not the only one suffering. But what did a diagnosis of epilepsy mean in 1889? Again, this is also a very broad term, used for all kinds of illnesses. And there is no evidence that Van Gogh suffered classic epileptic attacks. However, there was another form of epilepsy at the time, defined as epilepsie larvae mentale, which is very much outdated. And the symptoms of that illness, epilepsie larvae, matches Van Gogh's symptoms more closely. And epilepsie larvae translates as masked or disguised epilepsy. So it does not manifest itself in classic seizures, but does display other symptoms, both overexcitement, depression, irritability, memory loss, and possibly also hallucinations. Self-harm and suicide were possible actions, and the cause was mostly thought to be a hereditary predisposition with alcohol acting as a catalyst. It's always the alcohol. And the patient could become entirely lucid again after each attack, but the prognosis was that sooner or later another breakdown would leave the patient demented, that is, in a state of mental degeneration. Treatment was limited. Bromide was often prescribed to reduce the symptoms, as in Van Gogh's case, but the condition was considered to be incurable. And when Van Gogh was admitted to the asylum in Saint-Remy, a few months later, voluntarily, epilepsy was officially recorded by Dr. Byron in the records. He was the institution's director, but he probably simply followed Dr. Rij because he didn't have much knowledge about these kinds of diseases. You see there epileptic attacks. And here in the beautiful surroundings of Saint-Remy, you see here the hospital, the asylum, with the garden within, and the beautiful surroundings of Saint-Remy, Van Gogh was happy to work. He was quite optimistic. And it was also a relief for Van Gogh that he was able to blame his condition on an actual illness rather than straightforward insanity. When he was around other patients in the asylum, he was relieved to see that his condition was not that bad. And a beautiful, a bit longer quote because I think it says a lot, so I would really like to quote it in length. The fear of madness passes from me considerably upon seeing from close hand those who are affected with it, as I may very easily be in the future. So here Van Gogh sort of refers to the potentially serious outcome of the illness. Before I had some repulsions for these beings, and it was something distressing for me to have to reflect that so many people of our profession, Troyon, Marchal, Mirion, Junts, Matthijs Maris, Monticelli, a host of others, had ended up like that. All these painters who ended up in the hospital. I wasn't even able to picture them in the least in that state. And now he was one of them. For although there are some who howl or usually rave at the patients in the hospital, there's much true friendship that they have for each other. So Van Gogh found camaraderie among the patients. But that changed completely. After he worked happily and productively for weeks in the garden of the asylum and the surroundings, He suffered a new attack, for an episode, what you want to call it, mental breakdown. He was working on this specific painting at the time. And the impact of this episode was devastating. What little optimism he retained now vanished. He grew afraid at this point of his fellow patients, who are likely to have seemed very disturbing to him, maybe sort of confronting to see where you end up later on. It took him at least 6 weeks to recover from it, in which he did not work at all and did not write any letter to his brother. And afterwards, again, he reflected a great deal on his illness, but in contrary ways, as becomes visible in his letters to his brother, sister, and mother. To his brother, he wrote, for instance, that he believed the cause came from outside, something outside his body which he had no control over. And to his sister, he wrote a month later that alcohol wasn't the cause, because his crises were of an epileptic nature. So the cause came from inside now, but not his fault. And exactly a year after the incident of cutting off his ear, he writes to his mother, "It's a year since I became ill, and it's difficult for me to express the extent to which I have or haven't recovered. I often have terrible self-reproach about things in the past, my illness being pretty much my own fault." So here he's searching it inside and he's blaming himself. And finding the antidote became harder and harder, especially since he considered his work one of the causes for his illness, but also still a possible cure. And it did not mean that he was working less or without ambition. In early September, so it's still after the long, devastating episode he had, he writes to his brother, "My dear brother, I'm still writing to you between bouts of work. I'm plowing on like a man possessed. More than ever, I have a pent-up fury for work, and I think that this will contribute to curing me. Perhaps something will happen to me like the thing Eugène Delacroix speaks of. I found painting when I had neither teeth nor breath left, in the sense that my sad illness makes me work with a pent-up fury, very slowly, but from morning till night without respite and, this is probably the secret, work for a long time and slowly. What do I know about it?" So Van Gogh is still referring to the other artist who gives him inspiration and sort of a hold on to how to deal with it. And even the idea with the "I found painting when I had neither teeth nor breath left," referring to the idea that you had to sacrifice everything for your work. Only then you make the greatest artwork. He was still believing it at the time. And it was still a way of comforting himself. And he worked still very ambitious, you could say. So he made this, this is a copy of a black and white reproduction of Delacroix with the Christ, the Pietà with Christ and Mary. But he also made 4 self-portraits. And that, I think, is also quite a difficult thing to do when you're ill. When you're in an asylum, you had to look in the mirror and see yourself and, well, be aware of where you stand in life. The first he made 4 of them. I have only 3 here on the slide. This is the first one he made in still end of August. So he was still a bit recovering. And you see him also sort of in a timid way, sort of in this grayish colors, trying sort of to get himself out of the shell. Trying to be the painter again. And then he made this one, which is also in the exhibition. You see him already being more shown as the artist. You see him with the brushes and the palettes, and a little bit more standing up straight, looking himself and us in the eye, but still this grayish face and sort of a dark background, still recovering. And then he made this all in the same month, September 1889, he made this self-portrait with a much brighter background. But it's sort of it is a bit of a turbulent background as well. So his face is still a bit grayish, but he tries to be in a more calm way, depicting himself within the turbulence. So the calm artist within the turbulence of the hospital, maybe, he's trying to depict. And this is quite a telling quote now, which says a lot, I think, because he writes when he made these self-portraits, "To succeed, to have lasting prosperity, one must have a temperament different from mine. I'll never do what I could have and ought to have wanted and pursued." So he felt that this, again, his temperament and his body was a burden for him to become a real great artist. But as I have dizzy spells so often, I can only live in a situation of the 4th or 5th rank. While I clearly sense the value and originality and superiority of Delacroix, of Millet, another artist he admired greatly, for example, then I make a point of telling myself, yes, I am something, I can do something. So he's trying to be this better artist again, but maybe not in the 1st rank like Delacroix is, but he could be there in the 4th or 5th rank, sort of as a follower of Delacroix. Maybe equal him, but that's the only thing he could reach, was the equaling, not getting higher than that. And what it's interesting to know is that the self-portrait here, on the right, he considered to have exhibited in the Lavin exhibition, which was would have been 1890. So he was asked by the Artist Society to exhibit his work among other modern artists, so it's quite a good thing happening for his career, and he was considering to send this self-portrait as well. And it refers to, he sort of made the connection with this very ambitious self-portrait that earlier, with the idea of the clear background, the artist as a genius. But here it's much more sort of disquieting background than here. And Gauguin also made a self-portrait during this time, and he depicted himself as Christ in the Garden of Olives. He had a totally different idea of how to present himself as an artist, as this, again, this suffering artist, the martyr, like Jean Valjean in Les Miserables, now even as Christ. And Van Gogh was quite annoyed by these kinds of artwork. He found it way too exaggerating what Gauguin was doing. Well, and in this time, Van Gogh became increasingly consumed by feelings of anxiety, loneliness, and gloom, which now also struck during his lucid periods. And for this, Van Gogh blamed his bohemian lifestyle steeped in alcohol since his stay in Paris, and he blamed his choice of profession as a painter. He did continue nonetheless. And several months passed before he was able to leave the institution, as he suffered 3 further attacks. And in the meantime, he did show his art at Lavin. So that is this exhibition of modern art in Belgium. But as you see, there's no self-portrait. He sent his, one of the better works he made in Arles, but he didn't dare, apparently, to show himself in a self-portrait, knowing also that people realized at the time that he was in an asylum. Also known by Albert Aurier, because he had come to the attention of a prominent art critic, who was quick to romanticize the idea that the work had been produced by an artist in an asylum. And Van Gogh found this troubling. He didn't like to be depicted as this artist who was sort of hysterical and misunderstood yet. And he asked Theo, please ask Mr. Aurier not to write any more articles about my painting. When he had his last mental breakdown, his last episode still in the asylum, which lasted for about 2 months, he did work for a moment. With the other episodes, he didn't work at all, but here he did work and made these reminiscences of Brabant. You see the Dutch farming cottages here, but in the landscape of the south of France. So he was longing very much to the north again, and was really hoping to get back to the north, back to Paris or in the neighborhood. He didn't want to live in the city anymore, but somewhere in the neighborhood of Theo and in the beautiful surroundings. Because again, he was aware that he would not get better in the asylum. And I like to show these 2 paintings often together, because on the left one you see the undergrowth painting which he made in the beginning of his asylum stay, and on the right one he made one at the ending of his stay. And if you look at it, you could say, well, he was maybe very depressed and pessimistic still in the beginning, because it's quite darker in color. And you see here the gate of the garden, whereas this is much more cheerful. You see a path going outside without the gate present. But this is also important to remember. It's really, you shouldn't interpret it too much, the artworks, together with how he felt at the time. Because I would say that on the left, in the beginning of his asylum stay, he was much more optimistic about his work, about his life, than he was when he left the asylum. this is more a sort of cheerful work because he wanted his work to be cheerful, to be joyful. So it is more about how he wanted to feel than how he actually felt, because he knew he wouldn't get better. But he was very happy to arrive in Auvers. Again, beautiful surroundings where he could paint. And Dr. Cachet, who took care of him there, and also an amateur artist. And Dr. Cachet stated that there was not much wrong with Van Gogh. He did not believe that Vincent was insane, and there was no further talk of epilepsy. However, Van Gogh does not appear to have much faith in Cachet, who he claimed was just as sick as he was. But what you see here is that Cachet being depicted again, this modern portrait, again the ambition of creating the modern man. Cachet in this melancholy pose, so this is the sort of the known pose for the melancholy for centuries, sort of nostalgia, and with digitalis here in his hand, which was something given often when you felt melancholic, and Cachet was also an expert in melancholy. But the most important thing about this painting is the way he looked, because according to Van Gogh, he had a sad expression in his eyes, the sad expression of his time. And that was, again, what Van Gogh really wanted to depict, the modern man of his time. So also this idea of the sadness. And he connected this painting also with the two self-portraits, with these very bright backgrounds. So things seemed to be going well for Vincent in Auvers. He was living much more healthily as well, but he became increasingly aware of how alone he was and how his body was worn out. Theo was living nearby in Auvers in Paris as an art dealer and had a young family at the time, a wife and a newborn. And Van Gogh visited his brother and the young family in the beginning of July, and there was some kind of an argument going on. There was a bit of a tension. So when he came back, he wrote about it to Theo and his wife. Once back here, back from my visit, I too still felt very saddened, and had continued to feel the storm that threatens you also weighing upon me. What can be done? You see, I usually try to be quite good-humored, but my life too is attacked at the very root. My step also is faltering. Once back here, I set to work again, the brush, however, almost falling from my hands, and, knowing clearly what I wanted, I've painted another large 3 canvases since then. There are immense stretches of wheat fields under turbulent skies, and I made a point of them, a point of trying to express sadness, extreme loneliness. I'd almost believe that these canvases will tell you what I can't say in words, what I consider healthy and fortifying about the countryside. So it's again about the balance. So Van Gogh often walked in nature, and when he was sort of distressed, in nature he found his comfort as well as looking at the other artists. And in his painting he wanted to sort of depict the same kind of balance, this sort of comfort, the comforting feeling he had, which he really wanted to show Theo. And to make sure he made all kinds of landscapes in Auvers, not only turbulent skies. This is the sky after the rain, for instance, and there are also very sunny paintings made at the time. It was still the balance Van Gogh was searching for. But what you see in Auvers is that he does mention a few times that his work actually aggravated his illness, he believed. In an unfinished letter to his brother, the letter which was found in his pocket when he just shot himself in the chest, and he said in that unsent letter, "Oh, well, I risk my life for my own work, and my reason has half foundered in it very well." So he really believed he sacrificed himself for his work. The letter he did send to Theo, and it happened to be the last one as far as we know, sent that same day. "As for myself, I'm applying myself to my canvases with all my attention. I'm trying to do as well as certain painters whom I've liked and admired a great deal." He was much more positive in the letters he did send than he didn't send. And again, he's still referring to the other painters who were still examples for him, who were still the comfort and the inspiration. But it turned out that this is the last painting Van Gogh made. On the morning of the 27th of July, he made his 3 routes nearby the inn he was staying, and in the afternoon he walked into the fields and shot himself in the chest. And 2 days later, he died. And it remains a matter of conjecture how Van Gogh's illness would have manifested itself, and to what extent this was in keeping with the diagnosis of epilepsy larvae, for instance. We just don't know what really was going on with Van Gogh. In any case, his doctors were unable to do much for him. So let me quietly continue my work. If instead of a madman, well, too bad. Well, the continuation of his work stopped, unfortunately, and also, unfortunately, his name is often related to the idea of the mad genius. And I hope that you saw in this lecture that Van Gogh was always looking for the antidote for his artistic madness, as he called it, always searching for balance, even after he fell seriously ill and had to cope with this new reality. As we have seen, the relationship between creativity and mental illness felt very real to Van Gogh, but his references to it were nuanced, ambiguous, and changed over time. He based them on age-old commonplaces in line with contemporary medical views, but most of all, they were formed by his own experiences and the stories of like-minded artists. Although he believed at first that suffering was both inevitable and maybe even necessary for his art, in the end, he was not so sure anymore. He had experienced firsthand how devastating illness was, and in the end, his life was attacked by the very root, as he described it. And we can only speculate about his reasons for his suicide, but clearly there was no antidote left. Thank you.
If you could just wait for a microphone coming down.
So, are there any questions?
Yep, we got one right here. Excuse me. Oh, thank you.
Thank you. That was so interesting. I noticed that the last self-portraits, of course, did not show the side of his face where he had cut off his ear. I'm just wondering, was there ever any documentation about why he chose his ear rather than, I mean, it's macabre, but I'm just curious.
Yes, that's why cutting off your ear. I believe it's a quite irrational thing that he was doing, so probably it's hard also to rationalize such an act. There are many interpretations and speculations about why it's his ear, and I think we just don't know. He doesn't say anything about it. If it was sort of seriously done or if it was sort of an accident, we just don't know why he did that. But it is something you do when you're very in a desperate state and probably extremely drunk. So, not something to advise to do.
Hi, thank you very much. That was very, very interesting. I'm curious, with all the letters that he sent to his brother Theo, do we have any evidence of Theo writing back to him and discussing, the feelings that he was having about his illnesses and such?
Well, unfortunately, the letters Theo sent to Vincent, most of them are not kept. So Vincent maybe used the paper for other things or got rid of it. So most of the letters are Vincent to Theo. There are a few of them more in the later period, more in Auvers time, which are from Theo. And then you see, you can sort of get another impression about how Theo all experienced it. But Theo was also already quite ill in 1890, and that was, I think, the argument in Paris when Van Gogh visited his brother and the young family was probably due to the illness Theo had. He had third stage syphilis, we believe, and that's something you get really sort of out of your mind then. It's a serious illness, and he died not much later after Van Gogh. So I believe that Van Gogh was quite worried about Theo's health in the time. There are letters Dr. Carchet wrote to Theo and back, so you also get an impression there of how they discussed Vincent's illness. And it does not give much extra information of of the symptoms, not much more than what sort of is this described already. But interesting to see another perspective, indeed. I see 3 questions. You have to walk a lot down the stairs. Who wants to go first? I have here in the front.
Go right here.
2 questions. I had read somewhere that Van Gogh might have had syphilis as well, and I also wondered, I know he didn't have money, so the alcohol that he drank so much of, I wondered how toxic, whether there were toxic things in it that also poisoned him.
So the syphilis and the alcohol as possible diagnosis. I can say for syphilis, that was not the case with Van Gogh. There's no proof whatsoever that he had that, and syphilis was quite a good described illness at the time. They could recognize that quite clearly if you had that. So that's not an issue with Van Gogh. And alcohol, well, alcohol itself is quite toxic, I'd say. And he drank absinthe, and sometimes it's said, well, absinthe had at the time also this sort of opium things you could maybe sort of, you how do you say that, hallucinate. But with the amount of alcohol in absinthe, it doesn't matter what you put into it. The alcohol sort of kills everything in it, and the alcohol itself is quite, well, a terrible thing to do to your body if you drink it like that. So there and then there.
That was just so good. It was just, thank you so much for coming from your lovely city to ours. Was Vincent ambidextrous? The only reason I'm asking is because the self-portrait from January 1888 shows him holding his palette in his right hand, but the one in 1889 shows it in his left. And I know that being ambidextrous is also associated with certain kinds of mental distress, if you don't know whether you're right or left-handed. Could you say anything about that?
Yeah, so it's the question of how if you look at yourself in the mirror, then you have your mirror image being depicted, and the question, I think the idea is, but I don't have the latest details on it anymore, that he was a left-handed, but it sort of changes indeed in the portraits which side it is. But I'm not sure why he changed the direction later on in Saint-Remy. Indeed, when he looked the other side, you see it indeed in the hand with the 5 next to them. That until January 1889, they're still you see from us the left ear, and then I think the ones in Saint-Remy were really mirror images, and the other ones maybe. That he sort of shifted the mirror image. But yeah, you can maybe have sort of a psychoanalytic reading about that. I wouldn't dare to do that, what that exactly means. So we're not sure. Open to interpretation, I'd say. We had a question there.
Hello. Is there any
Is
there any documentation of Van Gogh's illness before he started painting in 1880?
Yeah, for the exhibition in 2016, I tried to sort of made an overview of everything we know about his health over the years, and there are already signs that he lived unhealthy and he had gonorrhea at one time. So there was some kinds of sexual diseases going on. And also his lifestyle. So there were these sort of symptoms, but none of them really was about an illness yet. And his parents were quite worried about Van Gogh. This is about 1879, I believe. It's just before he became an artist, or decided to become an artist. His parents were worried about the way he acted, because he didn't dress as you're supposed to dress, and he was sort of as a working class person walking around, which was not done at the time. And they tried to get him to a doctor to see what's going on. And this doctor, without seeing Van Gogh, said something about something going on in the brain. But this doesn't mean that much. It's quite hard if you look at the behavior of a person in history. You also have to know how behavior at the time was then, what normal behavior was. And if you were just a bit out of the ordinary, you were already considered to be a strange, maybe sick person. And now we would say, well, nothing wrong with him. He's just an interesting character, maybe. Until you cut off his hair. That, of course, is quite a strange thing to do, I'd say.
Okay, so that was an amazing lecture, thank you. So I'm a little stuck on the medical part of it. Was there ever, retrospectively it was said that maybe he had Meniere's disease, which could cause the dizzy attacks, it can cause severe tinnitus in his ear, and I had heard at one point that that was why he cut his ear off. Was there ever any reference to him being deaf or having lost his hearing?
No, the Meniere's disease, that's quite a rare disease, I believe, also hard to this day to sort of diagnose, because you sort of have to rule out other things first of all, and then you have the symptoms left over, and then you say maybe it's Meniere's disease. Right. And in 1990, it became a very popular diagnosis for Van Gogh by his ear and throat doctors. But there's no proof of it, because he talks about dizzy spells, yes. Right. So these doctors thought, well, dizziness, and he cut off his ear, 1 and 1 is 2. Maybe that's the reason why he did that. But there's nothing, well, he was dizzy because he didn't eat and was working in the sun, so we all would get dizzy about that. And there's not a, I would say, a convincing reason that that's why he cut off his ear. There's no mention of it that he heard sort of peeping sounds with the Meniere's disease, or being dizzy all the time, so there's no proof for that. Right. There are many diagnoses suggested for Van Gogh, and none of them stick.
Well, manic depressive is another one that was brought up,
yes.
Which, you know, given when he would work for hours at a time, could have been a manic stage, and then the suicide could have been that.
The manic depression, the bipolar disorder, often mentioned as well, that became popular when also bipolar disorder became a popular disease. And with that, you can say Van Gogh was, the last months of his life, or the last 18 months of his life, he had sort of this depressive mood. He always was gloomy, but there was some serious depression going on. You can say that. But there were periods when he could work again, when he was out of the depression and was able to work. You can say, oh, that's mania. But it was just Van Gogh coming out of his depression, I would say, and being able to work. And then he really took the day to work a lot. If I have a deadline, I also work sort of like crazy, and people around me think, what's going on with her? And afterwards, I'm completely tired. I'm not diagnosed with a bipolar disorder, and maybe it should, but so it's really hard to say that when is sort of manic behavior mania as a disease, or when is it just a way of working of a character. So there's not much convincing proof for that either.
Thank you.
More questions there in the back.
Hi, thank you so much. That was an excellent lecture. Was wondering where the rumor that he cut off his ear for a woman came to be, because that's one that I've heard over and over again, and you didn't mention it, so.
Yes, these are these details with Van Gogh that we do know about. Yes, when he cut off his ear, he brought his ear to a prostitute. That's the story there, and I think that happened, I believe. And then there's the question, why did it happen? What does that mean? But again, I think if you're still in this very irrational, drunken behavior, I'm not sure what was going on in his mind for doing that. But I think that did happen, that he gave it to a prostitute. And then he went back home and lay in his bed because he lost a lot of blood, so he was completely out of it and woke up in the hospital later on.
I realized you were doing a historical approach to the subject, but what's next for you? Have you had it with the subject of Gauguin and genius and madness, or would you like to really continuing this and answer the question that you said you weren't answering in the beginning.
So the question, if there is a relationship between creativity and mental illness, if I would be able or willing to answer that question. Well, the people who read my dissertation, because I was trying to be quite neutral in it, sort of being just a historian, just writing it down and have yourself judging it. Also, the many recent studies that were done by psychologists and psychiatrists studying the relationship, there's no convincing proof. And I think that if there is a relationship between the two, it means something else for each person. And it's not some one clear idea. It's more sort of a narrative, this popular image that we know about, or artists themselves know about. They play with it. You see many artists in the 20th century playing with the image of being this sort of, well, Gauguin already, this tortured artist. And the audience loves that. That sells your work. But I also think it gives a lot of inspiration. If you have this sort of, I think it's more about the suffering in life or just being sensitive to events in life. Then an artist is able to present that in his artwork or in a novel, and to sort of show that to the people around them, to make something felt. I don't think you have to suffer yourself as an artist to be able to depict something which is meaningful for others. And that's what I think a great artist can do, is being that sort of a mediator between that. And it doesn't matter if he had this experiences himself, but he has to be a very great observer and be empathetic in that sense. So is there a relationship? If you put a gun, to stick to the story, a gun to my head, I'd say no, not in that way, no. But it is an idea which is quite an interesting idea. Are there any more questions? Or is it a bit? It's a tough topic also. I hope you get here out of it with some cheerful ideas and not being too depressed yourself. Thank you.